The snow came down in thick sheets that December morning in 1883, turning the Colorado mountain pass into a treacherous white wilderness that swallowed everything in its path. And it was through this frozen hell that Kyle Vance spotted what he first thought was a ghost stumbling through the drifts. He pulled his horse to a sudden stop, squinting through the blizzard at the figure barely visible 30 yards ahead. The shape moved slowly, awkwardly, like someone who had already given up but whose body refused to quit. Kyle urged his mare forward, his breath clouding in front of his face as the bitter wind cut through his heavy coat. As he drew closer, his stomach dropped. It was a woman, and she was barefoot. Her feet left dark marks in the pristine snow, and Kyle knew without looking closely that those marks were blood. She wore only a thin cotton dress, torn at the hem and soaked through from the knees down. Her dark hair hung in wet tangles around her face, and she held her arms wrapped tightly around herself, shaking so violently that she could barely walk straight. She did not seem to notice him approaching until he was nearly beside her, and when she finally looked up, her blue eyes were glassy and unfocused, the kind of look Kyle had seen before on men dying of exposure in the mountains. "Madam," he said, dismounting quickly and catching her as she stumbled. Her skin was ice-cold beneath his hands, and up close he could see that her lips had taken on a frightening blue tinge. "What happened to you?" She tried to speak, but her teeth chattered so hard that no coherent words came out. Kyle did not waste time asking more questions. He sat her down in a drift, ignoring her weak protests, and pulled off his boots. His thick wool socks would provide some protection from the cold ground, and the woman needed the boots far more than he did. Her feet were worse than he had imagined, torn and bleeding, already showing the white patches that meant frostbite had set in. He worked quickly, forcing the boots onto her damaged feet as gently as he could. She whimpered with pain, but she did not pull away. "I know it hurts," Kyle said, his voice steady despite the urgency thrumming through his veins. "But we need to get you warm, and we need to do it fast. My name is Kyle Vance. I am going to get you somewhere safe." She nodded, still unable to speak through the violent shivering. Kyle stood and lifted her into his arms as easily as he would lift a child. She weighed almost nothing, all bone and freezing skin, and he wondered how long she had been out here in the storm. He settled her onto his horse first, then swung up behind her, wrapping his coat around both of them as best he could. She slumped against his chest, and he could feel the way her whole body trembled against him. Breckenridge was still 8 miles down the mountain, too far to risk in this weather with a woman half dead from exposure. But Kyle knew these mountains better than most, and he knew there was an old mining cabin about 2 miles east, off the main trail. It had been abandoned for years, but it would have 4 walls and a roof, which was more than they had now. He turned his mare and pushed her into a steady trot, one arm locked around the woman to keep her from sliding off. The ride seemed to take forever. The snow kept falling, the wind kept howling, and the woman in his arms kept shaking. Kyle talked to her the whole way, knowing she probably could not process his words but hoping the sound of his voice might keep her anchored to consciousness. "We are almost there," he said for the 3rd time, and this time it was actually true. The cabin emerged from the white curtain of snow like a blessing, sagging and weathered but still standing. Kyle dismounted and lifted the woman down, carrying her to the door. The wood had swollen from moisture, and he had to kick it twice before it gave way, revealing a single room thick with dust and the smell of old wood. He set her down near the stone fireplace, and immediately set to work building a fire. His hands moved with practiced efficiency, arranging kindling and larger pieces of wood he found stacked against the wall. Someone had left supplies here at some point, probably for exactly this kind of emergency. Within minutes, flames were licking up the chimney, filling the small space with light and the promise of warmth. Only then did Kyle turn his full attention to the woman. She had curled into herself on the floor, still shaking, her lips still that terrible blue color. Her eyes were closed now, and that frightened him more than anything else. He had seen men fall asleep in the cold and never wake up. "Madam," he said firmly, kneeling beside her and shaking her shoulder. "I need you to stay awake. Do you hear me? Stay awake." Her eyelids fluttered open, and for the first time he saw a flicker of real awareness in those blue eyes. "Cold," she managed to whisper. "I know. But the fire is going, and you are going to warm up. I need to get you out of these wet clothes." Even in her diminished state, he saw the flash of alarm cross her face. Kyle held up his hands. "I am going to turn my back and tend the fire. There are some old blankets in that chest over there. Get yourself out of that dress and wrap up in the blankets. Can you do that?" She nodded weakly. Kyle did as he promised, turning to face the fire and feeding it more wood while he listened to the rustle of fabric behind him. It seemed to take a very long time, and he heard her whimper several times with the effort. Finally, she spoke again, her voice a little stronger. "Done." He turned to find her wrapped in 3 wool blankets, the wet dress in a heap on the floor. The color was starting to return to her face, though she still shook. Kyle removed his coat and spread it on the floor near the fire, then lifted her again and set her down on the coat. He sat beside her, close enough that their shoulders touched, adding his body heat to the warmth of the fire. They sat in silence for a long time. Gradually, the shaking subsided. The blue faded from her lips, replaced by a natural pink. Kyle watched her from the corner of his eye, and as she recovered, he began to see past the effects of exposure to the woman beneath. She was young, probably not much past 20, with delicate features and that striking dark hair. Even disheveled and traumatized, she was beautiful. "Thank you," she finally said, her voice hoarse but clear. "You saved my life." "What happened to you?" Kyle asked. "How did you end up out here with no shoes, no coat, nothing?" Her face tightened and she looked away, staring into the flames. "My husband," she said quietly. "My late husband." Kyle waited, knowing there was more. "His name was Richard Werner. We were traveling to Denver from our ranch near Colorado Springs. The wagon broke an axle about 15 miles back, and we had to make camp while Richard tried to fix it. Last night, there was an accident." Her voice broke slightly. "The axe he was using to split wood slipped. It caught him in the leg, hit an artery. I tried to stop the bleeding. I tried everything I knew, but there was so much blood. He died in about 10 minutes. Kyle felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. "I am sorry." "I buried him as best I could, piled rocks over him so the animals would not get to him. But the storm was coming, and I could see how bad it was going to be. I knew I had to try to make it to town, or I would freeze to death up there. I gathered what I could carry, but when I was packing the wagon, some of the supplies shifted and fell on me, knocked me down hard. When I got up, my boots were gone, must have been buried under the supplies. I looked for them, but the snow was already starting and I could not find them. I thought I could make it anyway," she laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. "Stupid." "Not stupid," Kyle said firmly. "You did what you had to do to survive. That takes courage." She turned to look at him then, really look at him, and Kyle felt something shift in his chest. Her eyes were the blue of a mountain lake, and despite everything she had been through, they held strength. "What is your name?" he asked, realizing he had been carrying her, caring for her without even knowing that basic fact. "Alice," she said. "Alice Werner. Though I suppose I will go back to my maiden name now. Alice Whitmore." "Alice," Kyle repeated, liking the way it felt in his mouth. "Well, Alice Whitmore, you are safe now. When the storm breaks, I will take you down to Breckenridge and we will get you proper care, get you somewhere warm and safe." "What were you doing out in this storm?" she asked. "Seems like only a fool would be traveling in weather like this." Kyle smiled slightly. "Then I guess we are both fools. I was coming back from a mining operation up near Montezuma. I have a small stake in a silver claim there, and I was checking on the winter preparations. I knew the storm was coming, but I thought I could beat it down the mountain." He shrugged. "Wrong about that." "Lucky for me you were wrong," Alice said softly. They fell silent again, but it was a comfortable silence now. The fire crackled and popped, filling the cabin with warmth and flickering light. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside they were safe. Kyle found himself very aware of Alice beside him, the way the blankets had slipped slightly to reveal the curve of her shoulder, the way her hair was beginning to dry into soft waves around her face. He looked away, disturbed by his own thoughts. The woman had just lost her husband, for God's sake. She was grieving and traumatized, and here he was noticing how pretty she was. Kyle had never considered himself a disrespectful man, and he was not about to start now. "You should try to sleep," he said, standing up and moving to add more wood to the fire. "It is going to be a while before we can leave, and you need rest." "What about you?" Alice asked. "I will keep watch, keep the fire going. Do not worry about me." She looked like she wanted to argue, but exhaustion was clearly winning the battle. She lay down on his coat, still wrapped in the blankets, and within minutes her breathing had evened out into sleep. Kyle watched her for a moment, then forced himself to look away. He settled near the door, checking the cracks to see if the storm was letting up. It was not. If anything, it seemed to be getting worse. It was going to be a long night. The storm continued for 2 full days. Kyle and Alice settled into an uneasy routine inside the small cabin, rationing the little bit of food Kyle had in his saddlebags and melting snow for water. They talked to pass the time, carefully at first, but gradually with more ease. Kyle learned that Alice had been married to Richard Werner for only 8 months, an arrangement made more out of practical necessity than love. Her father had died the year before, leaving her alone on a small farm in Kansas. Richard had been a widower in need of a wife to help run his ranch, and Alice had needed security. It had been a business arrangement that they had both hoped would grow into something more, but death had come before that could happen. "I cared for him," Alice said on the second afternoon, as they sat by the fire eating the last of Kyle's dried beef. "He was kind to me, patient. But I cannot say I loved him. I feel guilty about that now, like I failed him somehow." "You did not fail anyone," Kyle said. "Love is not something you can force. It comes or it does not." "Have you ever been in love?" Alice asked, looking at him with open curiosity. Kyle considered the question. "I thought I was once. There was a girl in Texas where I grew up, Sarah Jane Corbett. We were going to get married, had the whole thing planned out. Then her father got a better offer from a rancher up north, someone with more money and better prospects than a cowboy with nothing but a horse and a dream. Sarah Jane chose the better offer. That must have hurt. It did at the time. But looking back, I think I was more in love with the idea of her than the actual person. She was pretty and sweet, and I was young and stupid, probably for the best that it did not work out." "How old are you now?" Alice asked. 26. "Been on my own since I was 17, drifting around, taking work where I could find it. Finally ended up here in Colorado about 3 years ago. Got lucky with that mining stake, and now I have a little money saved up, thinking about buying some land, settling down." "Where would you settle?" "Not sure yet. Somewhere with good water and grass for cattle. Maybe start a small ranch, nothing fancy, just enough to make a living and have something that is mine." He looked at her. "What about you? "What will you do now?" Alice was quiet for a long moment. "I do not know. The ranch was Richard's, and I suppose it will go to his brother now. I have no claim to it. I have a little money my father left me, but not much. I suppose I will have to find work somewhere, maybe as a seamstress or a teacher. I am good with numbers and reading." "You could go back to Kansas, to your farm." She shook her head. "I sold it when I married Richard. There is nothing there for me anymore." Her voice was matter-of-fact, but Kyle could hear the uncertainty underneath. Alice Whitmore was alone in the world now, with no home and no clear path forward. The realization made something protective rise up in him. "You will figure it out," he said with more confidence than he felt. "You are strong. Anyone who can survive what you just went through can handle whatever comes next." She gave him a small smile. "You do not even know me. I know enough." The storm finally broke on the morning of the third day. Kyle woke to silence, the absence of wind so profound after days of howling that it felt almost unnatural. He rose carefully, trying not to wake Alice, and opened the door. The world outside had been transformed. Everything was buried under 3 feet of fresh snow, pristine and glittering in the weak morning sun. The sky above was clear and painfully blue. "Is it over?" Alice asked from behind him, her voice thick with sleep. "It is over," Kyle confirmed. "We can leave today." Getting to Breckenridge proved more difficult than Kyle had anticipated. The snow was too deep for the horse to carry them both, so Kyle walked, leading the mare with Alice on her back. The boots he had given Alice were far too large for her, and he could see her wince with every step the horse took, her damaged feet still painful. His own feet, protected only by his wool socks, were soon soaked and numb. They had to stop frequently to rest, and what should have been a 2-hour journey stretched into 6. The sun was low in the sky by the time they finally spotted the buildings of Breckenridge through the trees. Kyle had never been so happy to see a town in his life. His feet were beyond pain now, just numb blocks of ice at the end of his legs, and he was worried about frostbite. Alice looked exhausted, slumped over the horse's neck, her face pale with pain and fatigue. They made their way to the main street, drawing stares from the people clearing snow from the walkways. Kyle supposed they made quite a sight. Him in his socks, her in boots that were clearly not hers, both of them filthy and bedraggled. He headed straight for the Gold Pan Saloon, which he knew also rented rooms upstairs. The proprietor, a broad-shouldered man named Tom Cassidy, took one look at them and immediately went into action. Within minutes, they had 2 rooms at the top of the stairs, hot water for baths, and the promise of a meal. The local doctor was sent for to check Alice's feet. "You did good, getting her here alive," Tom said to Kyle as they stood in the hallway outside Alice's room. "Another few hours in that storm and she would have been a goner for sure." "She is stronger than she looks," Kyle said. "She walked through all that on her own before I found her." The doctor, an elderly man named Peter Hollies, spent a long time examining Alice's feet. Kyle waited downstairs, warming his own feet by the saloon's fire and eating the first hot meal he had had in days. Finally, Dr. Hollies came down the stairs, his bag in hand. "She will keep her feet," he announced, and Kyle felt relief wash over him. But it was close. Another hour in the cold and we would have been having a different conversation. As it is, she has some frostbite and those cuts will take time to heal. She needs to stay off her feet for at least a week, keep them clean and warm. I left salve and bandages upstairs. Are you responsible for her care?" Kyle hesitated, not sure how to answer that. "I suppose I am for now." "Good. Make sure she follows my instructions, and get those boots back from her. Your feet need attention too." Kyle did as he was told, knocking softly on Alice's door. She called for him to enter, and he found her propped up in the bed, her feet wrapped in clean white bandages, looking more like herself than she had since he found her. Someone, probably Tom's wife Mary, had brought her a clean nightgown and helped her bathe. Her dark hair was brushed and braided over one shoulder. "Dr. Holly says you will be fine," Kyle said, staying near the door, suddenly awkward. In the cabin, they had grown comfortable with each other out of necessity. Here, in civilization, the rules were different. She was a woman alone in a bedroom, and he was an unmarried man, and people would talk. "Thanks to you," Alice said. "He told me what you did, walking all that way in just your socks. You could have lost your own feet." Kyle shrugged. "You needed the boots more than I did." "I need to give them back to you. Keep them for now. I will get some more tomorrow. You need them for when you are up and walking again." They looked at each other across the small room, and Kyle felt that strange pull again, the same feeling he had experienced in the cabin. There was something between them, some connection forged in desperation and survival. He did not know what to call it, but it was real. "The doctor says I have to stay off my feet for a week," Alice said, breaking the silence. "I do not have enough money for a week in this room." "Do not worry about that," Kyle said immediately. "I will take care of it." "I cannot let you do that. You have already done so much." "Alice," Kyle said, his voice firm, "you do not have a choice. You need to heal, and you need a safe place to do it. Let me help you." She looked like she wanted to argue, but finally she nodded. "Thank you. I will pay you back, I promise. When I get settled somewhere, find work. We will worry about that later. For now, just rest." Kyle left her then, closing the door softly behind him. He got his own room, a small space barely large enough for the narrow bed and a washstand, and collapsed onto the mattress fully clothed. He was asleep within seconds. The next few days fell into a pattern. Kyle would check on Alice in the morning, making sure she had breakfast and everything she needed. Then he would go about his business in town. He bought himself new boots and some supplies, checked in with the assay office about his mining stake, and tried not to think too much about the woman upstairs in the saloon. It was a losing battle. He thought about her constantly. He thought about the way she smiled when he brought her books to read from the general store, the way she laughed at his stories, the way her eyes lit up when she talked about the things she dreamed of doing with her life. He thought about how brave she was, how strong, how kind. He thought about her far too much for a woman he had known only a few days. On the fourth day, Dr. Hollies declared her well enough to walk around the room as long as she took it easy. On the fifth day, she made it downstairs for dinner, leaning on Kyle's arm. They sat together in the corner of the saloon, eating stew and cornbread while a piano player banged out cheerful tunes across the room. "I have been thinking," Alice said, pushing her food around on her plate, "about what I am going to do next." Kyle's stomach tightened, though he did not know why. "And? I think I should go to Denver. It is a bigger city, more opportunities for work. I could find a position as a governess or a clerk, something like that, make enough to support myself." "Denver," Kyle repeated flatly. "Do you think that is a bad idea?" "Yes," he wanted to say. "It is a terrible idea because Denver is a rough city and you would be alone and I would worry about you every single day." But he had no right to say any of that, so instead he said, "I think you should do whatever feels right to you." Alice looked disappointed, though she tried to hide it. "Well, I cannot stay here forever, and I cannot keep letting you pay for my room and board. I need to stand on my own feet again, literally and figuratively." "You are right," Kyle said, though the words tasted like ash in his mouth. "When were you thinking of leaving?" "Another few days, maybe, when the doctor clears me for travel. I could take you," Kyle offered. "Make sure you get there safely." "You have done enough for me, Kyle. You have already given me so much. I cannot keep taking from you. It would not be taking." "I want to help." Alice reached across the table and took his hand, and Kyle felt the touch all the way down to his bones. "You are a good man," she said softly. "The best man I have ever known, but I need to do this on my own. Can you understand that?" He did not understand it, not really, but he nodded anyway. "If that is what you want." "It is what I need," she corrected, squeezing his hand before letting go. That night, Kyle lay in his small room and stared at the ceiling, unable to sleep. The thought of Alice leaving, of never seeing her again, sat in his chest like a stone. He had known her for less than a week. How had she become so important to him so quickly? It did not make sense. It was not rational, and yet here he was, miserable at the thought of her absence. He was still awake when the knock came at his door, so soft he almost missed it. He got up and opened it to find Alice standing in the hallway, wrapped in a shawl over her nightgown, her feet still bandaged. "Alice, what is wrong?" "I could not sleep," she said. "Can I come in?" It was improper, scandalous even, for her to be in his room in the middle of the night. Kyle should have said no. Instead, he stepped aside and let her in, closing the door behind her. They stood there in the dim light from the single lamp, looking at each other. Alice's dark hair was loose around her shoulders, and her eyes were bright with something Kyle could not quite name. "I lied earlier," she said abruptly. "At dinner when I said I needed to go to Denver on my own. That was a lie." Kyle's heart started to beat faster. "What do you mean?" "I mean I do not want to go to Denver. I do not want to be on my own. I want to stay here with you. But I do not know if you want the same thing, and I am afraid to ask because if you say no, it will break my heart." Kyle closed the distance between them in 2 steps, taking her face in his hands. "Alice, I have been going crazy thinking about you leaving. I know it has only been a few days. I know this is all happening too fast, but I do not care. I have never felt like this about anyone, and I do not want to lose you." "Then do not let me go," she whispered. He kissed her then, soft and careful, like she was something precious that might break. She kissed him back, her hands coming up to grip his shirt, pulling him closer. It was a first kiss and a promise and a beginning all at once. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Kyle rested his forehead against hers. "Stay," he said simply. "Stay with me." "Yes," Alice answered without hesitation. "Yes." They sat on his narrow bed and talked for hours, making plans and dreaming out loud. Kyle told her about his idea to buy land and start a ranch, and Alice told him about her dream of having a real home, a place that was hers and could never be taken away. They talked about the future like it was a sure thing, like they had known each other for years instead of days. "I know people will talk," Kyle said as the first light of dawn started to show through the window. "A widow remarrying so quickly. They will say it is not proper, that you have not mourned long enough." Alice shook her head. "Richard would understand. He was a practical man. He would want me to be happy, to be taken care of. And I did mourn him in my own way. But I will not spend years in black just to satisfy what other people think is proper. Life is too short. What happened to Richard proved that." "We should do it soon then," Kyle said. "Get married, I mean." "If that is what you want." "Is that a proposal?" Alice asked, a smile playing at her lips. Kyle got off the bed and knelt in front of her, taking her hands in his. "Alice Whitmore, I know this is crazy and fast and probably foolish, but I have never been more sure of anything in my life." "Will you marry me?" "Yes," she said, laughing and crying at the same time. "Yes, yes, yes." They were married 3 days later by the minister at the small church on the edge of town. Alice wore a simple blue dress borrowed from Mary Cassidy, and Kyle wore his cleanest shirt and pants. Tom Cassidy and his wife stood as witnesses, and a handful of townspeople who had heard the story of the cowboy and the woman in the snow came to watch. The ceremony was brief and simple, but when Kyle kissed his bride at the end of it, he felt like the richest man in the world. Alice was his now, and he was hers, and whatever came next they would face it together. They spent their wedding night in Kyle's small room above the saloon, and it was everything a wedding night should be, tender and passionate and full of promise. Kyle had been with women before, casual encounters that meant nothing, but this was different. This was making love to someone he truly cared about, someone who cared about him in return, and it changed everything. Afterwards, they lay tangled together in the narrow bed, Alice's head on Kyle's chest, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on her shoulder. "I have something to confess," Alice said softly. "What is that?" "When you found me in the snow, when you gave me your boots and carried me to that cabin, I thought you were some kind of angel. I was so cold and so tired, and I had given up. I was ready to just lie down and let it end. But then there you were, and you saved me. You gave me back my life." Kyle tightened his arms around her. "You saved me too, you know. I was drifting before I met you, just going through the motions. I had no real purpose, no reason to build something lasting. You gave me that reason." "We saved each other then," Alice said. "I guess we did." They stayed in Breckenridge for another 2 weeks while Alice's feet finished healing and Kyle made arrangements for their future. He used the money from his mining stake to buy a parcel of land about 10 miles south of town, a beautiful valley with a creek running through it and good grazing land. It was not a huge spread, but it was enough to start with, enough to build a life on. They moved into a small house on the property, just 3 rooms and a loft, but it was theirs. Alice cried the first time she walked through the door, overwhelmed by the idea that she finally had a home that no one could take away from her. They spent the first few months fixing up the place, making it comfortable, turning it into something that felt like home. Kyle bought a small herd of cattle and some horses, and Alice started a vegetable garden. It was hard work, sunrise to sunset most days, but they were happy. Kyle had never been happier in his life. He woke up every morning with Alice beside him, and every morning he had to stop himself from just staring at her like a fool, amazed that this incredible woman had chosen him. Spring came and turned the valley green. Summer followed, hot and long, perfect for growing things. Alice's garden flourished, and she started selling vegetables in town, earning her own money that she saved in a tin box under their bed. Kyle's herd grew, and he hired a hand to help with the work, a young man named Peter who lived in a small cabin on the far side of the property. Fall arrived with golden aspens and crisp air, and Alice told Kyle she was pregnant. He had been mending a fence when she came out to tell him, walking across the field with that particular smile she got when she had good news. He knew before she said anything, knew from the look on her face, and his heart started to race. "Are you sure?" he asked, and she nodded. "Dr. Holly's confirmed it this morning. The baby will come in the spring, probably late April." Kyle dropped his tools and picked her up, spinning her around while she laughed and told him to be careful. He did not care. He was going to be a father. He and Alice were going to have a child. It was everything he had ever wanted and never dared to hope for. The pregnancy was not easy. Alice was sick most of the first few months, barely able to keep food down. Kyle worried constantly, hovering over her until she finally told him to stop treating her like she was made of glass. But as the months went on and her belly grew round, the sickness faded and she bloomed. She had never looked more beautiful to him, carrying their child, moving through their home with purpose and joy. Winter came again, the first anniversary of the day Kyle had found Alice in the snow. They spent the evening by the fire, Alice knitting baby clothes while Kyle read out loud from a book of poetry she loved. Outside, snow fell softly, covering their valley in white, but inside they were warm and safe and together. "You ever think about that day?" Alice asked suddenly. "When you found me?" "All the time," Kyle admitted. "I think about how close I came to taking a different trail. If I had left an hour later or gone a different route, I never would have found you. You would have died out there, and I would have spent the rest of my life not knowing you existed." "I think about that too," Alice said. "About how many little choices led to that moment. If Richard's axe had not slipped, if I had decided to stay with his body instead of trying to walk to town, if the storm had come an hour earlier, any of those things and we would not be here right now." "But we are here," Kyle said, moving to sit beside her on the floor. He put his hand on her swollen belly and felt their baby move beneath his palm. "We are here and we are together and we have all of this. That is what matters." "I love you," Alice said, covering his hand with hers. "I know I do not say it enough, but I do. I love you so much it scares me sometimes." "I love you too. More than I thought I could love anyone." They sat there together, watching the fire and feeling their baby move, content in a way that needed no words. Alice went into labor on a warm afternoon in late April, right on schedule. The baby, contrary to Kyle's expectations, took their time arriving. Alice labored through the night and into the next day with Dr. Hollies and Mary Cassidy in attendance. Kyle was banished to the barn, where he paced and worried and tried not to imagine all the things that could go wrong. It was late afternoon when Peter came running to tell him it was over. Kyle rushed back to the house, his heart pounding, and found Alice propped up in their bed, exhausted but smiling, holding a tiny bundle wrapped in a soft blanket. "Meet your son," she said as he approached the bed. "A son." Kyle looked down at the tiny red face, the miniature fingers curled into fists, and felt something crack open in his chest. His son. His and Alice's son. The baby opened his eyes, unfocused and dark blue, and Kyle was completely lost. "He is perfect," Kyle whispered. "You are perfect." They named him Jacob, after Kyle's father, and the boy proceeded to turn their lives completely upside down. Kyle had thought he understood what exhaustion was after long days of ranching, but nothing had prepared him for the reality of a newborn who needed feeding and changing at all hours. Alice handled it with patience and humor, though Kyle could see the toll it took on her. He tried to help as much as he could, walking the floor with Jacob when he cried at night, changing diapers, singing off-key lullabies. As Jacob grew from a tiny newborn into a chubby baby and then a curious toddler, Kyle found himself falling even more in love with Alice, watching her mother their son. She was patient and kind, but also firm when she needed to be, teaching Jacob right from wrong, reading to him every night, singing him songs she remembered from her own childhood. The ranch continued to grow and prosper. Kyle bought more land, expanded the herd, hired more help. Alice's garden became famous in Breckenridge for producing the best vegetables in the valley, and she started selling preserves and pickles as well. They were not rich, but they were comfortable, and more importantly, they were happy. When Jacob was 3 years old, Alice told Kyle she was pregnant again. This time, the pregnancy was easier, and she gave birth to a daughter they named Lily. 2 years after that came another son, Thomas. Their house, which had seemed plenty big when it was just the two of them, suddenly felt crowded with 3 children running around. So Kyle spent a summer building an addition, adding 2 more bedrooms and expanding the kitchen. The years passed in a blur of hard work and family dinners, of teaching children to ride horses and tend gardens, of Christmas mornings and summer picnics by the creek. Kyle watched his children grow and felt blessed beyond measure. Jacob grew tall and serious, with Alice's blue eyes and Kyle's stubborn determination. Lily was wild and fearless, always climbing things she should not climb and getting into mischief. Thomas was quiet and thoughtful, happiest when he was reading books or drawing pictures. Alice flourished as a mother and a wife, but she also continued to be her own person. She took correspondence courses in bookkeeping and started keeping the ranch accounts, proving to have a natural head for business. She was the one who suggested they diversify, raising chickens and pigs in addition to cattle, and her instincts proved correct. The ranch became one of the most successful in the area. Through it all, Kyle and Alice's love for each other only deepened. They had their arguments, of course, disagreements about how to handle money or raise the children or run the ranch. But they always talked it out, always found their way back to each other. Kyle still looked at his wife and could not quite believe his luck, that this incredible woman had chosen to spend her life with him. On their 10th anniversary, Kyle took Alice back to the old mining cabin where they had sheltered from the storm. It was still standing, though even more weathered than before. They left the children with Mary Cassidy for the weekend and rode up the mountain together, bringing supplies for a night's stay. "I cannot believe it has been 10 years, Alice said as they stood in the cabin doorway, looking at the dusty interior. "It feels like yesterday and a lifetime ago all at once." "Best 10 years of my life," Kyle said, wrapping his arms around her from behind. They cleaned up the cabin a bit and built a fire in the old fireplace, just like that first night. They spread blankets on the floor and lay down together, talking and laughing about all the things that had happened since that desperate day in the snow. "You ever regret it?" Kyle asked as they lay in each other's arms. "Marrying me so fast, giving up the chance to see what else was out there." "Never," Alice said firmly. "Not once. You gave me everything I ever wanted, Kyle. A home, a family, love, real true love. How could I possibly regret that?" "I gave you a lot of hard work and 3 wild children," Kyle pointed out. "Best hard work I ever signed up for," Alice said, kissing him. "I would do it all again in a heartbeat." "Would you?" "In a heartbeat," Kyle agreed. "Even faster if that is possible." They made love that night in the cabin where their story had begun, and it was just as sweet and passionate as it had been on their wedding night, tempered now with a decade of shared life and deep knowledge of each other. When they rode back down the mountain the next day, Kyle felt renewed. Whatever challenges lay ahead, whatever the future held, he knew they would face it together. That was all that mattered. More years passed. Jacob grew into a young man and started courting a girl from town, a smart and pretty young woman named Emma who Alice immediately adored. Lily remained wild and independent, declaring she had no interest in marriage and wanted to go to college instead, to study veterinary medicine. Kyle and Alice supported her, even though it was unusual for a woman to pursue such a career. Thomas showed artistic talent and talked about going to Denver to study art. Kyle's hair started to show gray at the temples, and he noticed it took him longer to recover from a hard day's work. Alice's face showed the first fine lines around her eyes and mouth, but to Kyle she was just as beautiful as the day he had found her in the snow. Maybe more beautiful, because now when he looked at her, he saw not just her physical beauty but the accumulation of all their years together. Every shared joy and overcome challenge written in those lines. They became grandparents when Jacob and Emma married and had a daughter. Then another grandchild came, and another. The house that Kyle had built became a gathering place for family, filled with noise and laughter and love during holidays and Sunday dinners. One evening, when Kyle was 60 years old and Alice was 58, they sat together on the porch of their home, watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and purple. Their children were grown and gone, building their own lives, though they visited often. The ranch was in good hands, with Jacob taking over most of the day-to-day management now. Kyle and Alice had earned the right to slow down a bit, to enjoy the fruits of their decades of hard work. "You remember what you said to me that first night in the cabin?" Alice asked, her hand in his. When I could barely speak because I was so cold. I said a lot of things that night, Kyle said. You told me your name was Kyle Vance and that you were going to get me somewhere safe. You said it with such certainty, such confidence. I believed you, even though I had no reason to. You were a stranger and I was dying, but I believed you. I meant it, Kyle said. I would not have let anything happen to you. I know. You have been keeping that promise for 35 years now, keeping me safe, making me happy, giving me a life I never dared to dream of. You have done the same for me, Alice. Before you, I was just drifting. You gave me purpose. You gave me a reason to build something lasting. They sat in comfortable silence, hands linked, watching the sky fade from gold to deep blue. A cool breeze carried the scent of Alice's roses from the garden she still tended every day. Somewhere in the distance, cattle lowed softly. I hope I go first, Alice said suddenly. Kyle turned to look at her, startled. What? When the time comes, I hope I die before you do. I do not think I could bear to lose you, to have to live in this world without you in it. Is that selfish? If it is, then I am selfish too, because I feel the same way. But let us not talk about dying, not yet. We have a lot of living left to do. Promise me something, Alice said, squeezing his hand. Anything. Promise me that no matter what happens, you will remember that you saved my life. Not just that day in the snow, but every day since. You saved me in every way a person can be saved. Kyle brought her hand to his lips and kissed it gently. You saved me right back. That makes us even. No, Alice said, smiling. That makes us lucky. They sat on the porch until the stars came out, until the night air grew cool enough to drive them inside. They went to bed in the room they had shared for over 3 decades, in the house Kyle had built with his own hands, on the land they had worked together to make prosper. Kyle held Alice close, breathing in the familiar scent of her hair, feeling the steady rhythm of her heartbeat against his chest. He thought about the day he had found her, barefoot and dying in the snow. He thought about the impulse that had made him give her his boots, the strength that had let him carry her to safety. He thought about how one moment of compassion, one choice to help a stranger, had led to this entire life. If he could go back and talk to his younger self, the cowboy riding through that blizzard, he would tell him to hold on tight. He would tell him that the woman he was about to find would become the center of his entire world. He would tell him that love can happen in an instant and last a lifetime. He would tell him that the best things in life are worth fighting for, worth working for, worth every sacrifice. But his younger self had figured that out on his own, had known it the moment he saw Alice's face in the firelight of that old cabin. Some truths do not need to be taught. Some truths you just know, deep in your bones, the moment you encounter them. Outside, an owl hooted softly. The creek babbled over its stones, the same sound it had made every night for 35 years. The mountains stood eternal in the darkness, watching over the valley and the ranch and the people who called it home. Inside, Kyle and Alice slept, wrapped around each other, safe and warm and together. Years continued to pass, marked by the changing of seasons and the growing of grandchildren. Kyle and Alice settled into old age with the same grace they had brought to every other stage of their lives together. They slowed down, but they did not stop. Alice still tended her garden, though she moved more carefully now, and Kyle still rode out to check on the cattle, though he let Jacob do most of the heavy work. Their love story became something of a legend in Breckenridge. People still talked about the cowboy who had given his boots to a dying woman in a snowstorm, who had carried her to safety, and then married her days later. Young couples came to them sometimes, asking for advice on how to make a marriage last, and Kyle and Alice would share what they had learned. Listen to each other, Alice would say. Really listen, not just wait for your turn to talk. Be kind even when you are angry, Kyle would add. Especially when you are angry. Remember why you fell in love in the first place, they would say together. And choose to keep falling in love every single day. On a cold December morning, exactly 50 years after Kyle had found Alice in the snow, their children and grandchildren gathered at the ranch for a celebration. The house was full to bursting with people and noise and love. Someone had baked a cake. Someone else had strung up decorations. The grandchildren ran around shrieking while their parents tried to maintain order. Kyle and Alice sat in the place of honor at the head of the long table Kyle had built years ago, watching the chaos with happy hearts. Jacob stood to make a toast, raising his glass high. "To my parents," he said, and the room fell quiet. 50 years ago, my father saved my mother's life. He gave her his boots and carried her through a blizzard, and then he gave her his heart and his name and his whole life. They have built something extraordinary together. A family, a legacy, an example of what real love looks like. We are all here because of that moment in the snow, because of that choice my father made to stop and help a stranger." To Kyle and Alice. To Kyle and Alice, everyone echoed, raising their glasses. Kyle looked at Alice and she looked at him, and in that moment they were not old people surrounded by their descendants. They were young again, sitting by a fire in an abandoned cabin, making promises and dreaming about the future. They were walking down the aisle of a small church, saying vows that would define the rest of their lives. They were watching the sun rise over their valley, planning and working and building. They were holding their firstborn son, amazed and terrified and utterly in love. They were all of these things at once, every moment of their 50 years together present in that single shared glance. "I love you," Alice whispered, so only Kyle could hear. "I love you too," Kyle whispered back. "Always have, always will." The party went on around them, but for a moment it was just the two of them, alone in their bubble of shared history and deep affection. Then Lily's youngest daughter climbed into Alice's lap demanding a story, and the moment passed, swept away by the happy chaos of family. As the sun set on that December day, painting the snow-covered valley in shades of pink and gold, Kyle looked around at everything they had built. The ranch was prosperous and would continue for generations. Their children were happy and successful, making their own marks on the world. Their grandchildren were healthy and loved. And through it all, Alice had been by his side, his partner in every sense of the word. That night, after everyone had gone home or gone to bed, Kyle and Alice stood at their bedroom window, looking out at the stars. Kyle wrapped his arms around Alice from behind, resting his chin on top of her head. "Thank you," he said softly. "For what?" "For walking through that snowstorm. For being stubborn enough to survive. For saying yes when I asked you to marry me. For every single day of the last 50 years. Alice turned in his arms to face him. Her hair was white now, her face lined with age, but her eyes were still that same brilliant blue that had captured him the first time he saw them. "Thank you for giving me your boots, for carrying me to safety, for building me a home, for loving me every single day, even when I was difficult." "You were never difficult," Kyle lied, and Alice laughed. "I was sometimes. We both were, but we figured it out." "We did," Kyle agreed. "We always did." They stood there together, two old people who had been young together, who had built a life and a family and a love that would outlast them both. Outside, snow began to fall, soft and gentle, covering the world in white just like it had that day 50 years ago. But this time, they were not lost and dying in a blizzard. This time they were home, safe and warm, surrounded by the evidence of a life well lived and a love well tended. This time the snow was not a threat, but a benediction, a reminder of how far they had come and how much they had survived together. Kyle and Alice went to bed that night as they had every night for 50 years, wrapped around each other, comfortable in the way only people who have shared a lifetime can be. They talked quietly about the day, about their children and grandchildren, about the little things that filled their life with meaning. Eventually, Alice's breathing evened out into sleep. Kyle stayed awake a little longer, holding his wife, thinking about destiny and choice and the strange way life unfolds. If he had taken a different trail that day, if he had not stopped, if he had not given her his boots. Every version of his life that did not include Alice seemed impossible now, a nightmare he was grateful he had never lived. He fell asleep with a smile on his face, grateful beyond measure for the woman in his arms and the life they had built together. One choice at a time, one day at a time, one moment of love at a time. The years moved on as they always do. Kyle and Alice grew older, their steps slower, their bodies less willing than their minds. But their love remained strong, tested by time and proven unbreakable. They still held hands when they walked. They still kissed goodnight before sleep. They still looked at each other and saw not just who they were now, but who they had always been to each other. Everything. When Kyle was 75, he suffered a heart attack while out checking on the cattle. Jacob found him and got him to the doctor in time, and he recovered, but it was a warning. The body that had served him so faithfully for so many years was wearing out. Alice nursed him back to health with the same fierce determination she brought to everything, bullying him into following doctor's orders and taking his medicine. "You are not leaving me yet," she told him firmly. "We still have more years together. I am not done with you." "Yes, madam," Kyle said meekly, and did what he was told. He recovered, and they had 3 more good years. 3 more years of sitting on the porch and watching grandchildren play. 3 more years of quiet mornings over coffee and gentle evenings by the fire. 3 more years of shared jokes and comfortable silence, and the kind of deep companionship that only comes from spending a lifetime together. On a spring morning when the valley was green and new, when Alice's flowers were in bloom and the creek ran high with snowmelt, Alice did not wake up. She died in her sleep, peaceful and quiet, still held in Kyle's arms. One moment she was there, breathing softly against his chest, and the next she was gone, slipped away so gently that Kyle did not notice at first. When he understood that she was really gone, Kyle felt something break inside him that he knew would never be fixed. He held her close and wept like he had never wept in his life, great tearing sobs that came from the depths of his soul. His Alice, his partner, his love. The woman who had transformed his life with her presence was gone, and the world felt wrong without her in it. The funeral was held at the church where they had married 53 years earlier. The building overflowed with people who had known and loved Alice. Her children spoke, their voices breaking with grief. Her grandchildren sang. The minister said words about eternal life and heaven and God's plan, but Kyle barely heard them. He sat in the front pew, staring at the coffin that held his wife's body, and felt untethered from reality. They buried her in a plot on a hill overlooking the valley, the same valley they had worked and loved and raised their family in. Kyle stood by the grave long after everyone else had left, unable to make himself walk away. How could he leave her here? How could he go back to that house where everything would remind him of her absence? Jacob eventually came and gently led him away, took him home, sat with him while he cried. The house felt huge and empty without Alice in it. Her coffee cup still sat on the kitchen counter from the morning before. Her book was still on the nightstand, marked with a ribbon at the page she had been reading. Her coat still hung by the door. Everything was exactly as she had left it, but she would never use any of it again. Kyle moved through the next few weeks in a fog of grief. His children tried to help, tried to comfort him, but there was no comfort to be had. He had lost the center of his world, and he did not know how to function without her. Slowly, painfully, he learned. He learned to make coffee just for himself in the mornings, though he still found himself reaching for a second cup for her before remembering. He learned to cook simple meals, though food tasted like ashes in his mouth. He learned to fill the long, empty hours of the day with small tasks and busy work. But mostly, he remembered. He sat on the porch and remembered Alice's laugh, the way her eyes crinkled at the corners when she was amused. He walked through the house and remembered raising their children here, the chaos and joy of those years. He went to the grave every day and told Alice about his day, about what the grandchildren were doing, about how the ranch was running. "I am not far behind you," he would tell her gravestone. "Just give me a little more time to get things in order and then I will join you. Wait for me." 2 years passed. Kyle continued to decline, his body finally giving up after a lifetime of hard work. He did not fight it. He had no desire to live in a world without Alice. He had stayed as long as he could to make sure the ranch was in good hands, to see that his children and grandchildren were settled and happy. But his work was done. He was ready, on a cold December morning, exactly 55 years after he had found Alice in the snow. Kyle Vance died in his sleep. His children found him lying peacefully in the bed he had shared with Alice for over 50 years. A slight smile on his face, his hand stretched out to the empty space where she used to sleep. They buried him next to Alice on the hill, overlooking the valley. The whole town came to the funeral, wanting to pay respects to a man who had been a pillar of their community for over half a century. People told stories about Kyle and Alice, about their legendary love story, about the cowboy who had given his boots to a dying woman and gained a lifetime of love in return. On Kyle's gravestone, beneath his name and dates, Jacob had a single line engraved. He saved her life. She made his worth living. And next to it, on Alice's stone, she fought to survive. He gave her a reason. Years continued to pass, but the story of Kyle and Alice lived on. Their descendants told it to their children, who told it to their children. The ranch they had built remained in the family, prospering and growing. The valley stayed beautiful, a testament to their care and stewardship. Sometimes on winter mornings when the snow fell soft and gentle, people swore they could see 2 figures walking hand in hand across the white fields, a tall man and a slender woman, young and in love, together again at last. It was just a trick of the light, of course, snow swirling in the wind and creating shadows. But the old-timers in Breckenridge liked to think it was real, liked to think that a love as strong as Kyle and Alice's could not be contained even by death. And in the house that Kyle built, where generations of his family continued to live and love and raise children of their own, there was a warmth that went beyond wood and stone. It was the warmth of a life well lived, of a love fully realized, of 2 people who had found each other in the midst of a deadly storm and chosen to spend the rest of their lives being grateful for that miraculous meeting. The boots Kyle had given Alice, cracked and worn with age, were preserved in a glass case in the house's front room. Beside them was the story, written in Alice's own hand years before her death, of that terrible and wonderful day when a cowboy had given her his boots and carried her to safety, and in doing so had carried her into a future neither of them could have imagined. "Life is strange," Alice had written at the end of her account. "You can go from dying alone in a blizzard to building a family and a home and a lifetime of love, all because one good man made one good choice. Kyle saved my body that day in the snow, but he saved my soul too." He showed me what love looks like when it is real and true and unshakable. He gave me everything, and all I gave him in return was my heart, which seemed like such a small thing, but he treated it like treasure. We had 53 years together, and I am grateful for every single one of them. If you are reading this, know that real love exists. It can happen in an instant and last forever. It can survive hardship and heartbreak and the simple wearing away of time. Kyle and I are proof. Find your own love, fight for it, treasure it. It is the only thing that really matters in the end. The last line of Alice's account, written in a shaky hand near the end of her life, reads simply, "I would walk through that blizzard again if I knew he would be at the end of it." And so the story ended, as all stories must, with death but also with life, with loss but also with love. Kyle and Alice's physical bodies were gone, returned to the earth they had worked for so many years. But their love remained, woven into the fabric of the family they created, the land they tended, the community they served. Their love remained in the stories told around dinner tables, in the values passed down through generations, in the example they set of what it means to really love someone. The cowboy had seen a woman walking barefoot in the snow. He had given her his boots and carried her the rest of the way. And that simple act of compassion had blossomed into something beautiful and lasting and true. It was proof that one moment can change everything. That one choice can define a life. That love, when it is real, can overcome anything. Their story was complete. Their circle was closed. And in the valley they had loved, life went on, nurtured by the foundation they had built, blessed by the love they had shared, made richer by the example they had left behind.